My name is Lena Holloway. I am 29 years old. And on the night my family raised their glasses to declare my sister the only future of the Holloway name, I was the one handed something that could tear apart every lie they had built around my life. And when a stranger walked toward me with a sealed envelope, I did not yet know that all the silence I had swallowed for more than 20 years was about to turn into real power. From a young age, my parents called me many different things, but they all meant the same. I was the slow one, the one who could not keep up, the one not sharp enough to bring pride to the family, and they never needed to shout to make me shrink. They only needed short introductions and the way their attention always settled completely on my sister. My sister, Audrey Holloway, was always treated like a promise already fulfilled. My father, Jonathan Holloway, spoke about her in a steady tone as if he were signing a major deal. My mother, Margaret Holloway, described her future the way people describe a building already completed, while I was usually introduced with half a sentence and then left behind. I was diagnosed with dyslexia at the age of 7. Words would not stay still in front of me, and my parents chose the easier explanation that some children are simply not born to succeed academically, and they repeated it long enough that I eventually believed it. We lived in a glass house overlooking Elliott Bay. Holloway Infrastructure Group had its name on ports, waterfront developments, and redevelopment projects that the media praised as marks of the city. And at dinner, the conversations were always about capital, legal strategy, and investments. Audrey was spoken of as the one who would take over everything, while I existed as the silent background of that family picture. But there was one person who never saw me as background: my grandmother, Ruth Holloway, who lived in an old house near the water. She handed me old blueprints, construction contracts, and planning diagrams from the early days when she built the company, and asked me what I saw. At first, I thought she was just being patient with a less capable granddaughter, but then I realized she was truly listening. When I could not read a page smoothly, I could point out a flawed joint in a construction plan. When I could not remember a long passage, I could identify the risks hidden beneath polished language. I did not see words quickly. I saw structure. When I was 14, my father brought home a model of a port project. I studied it for a long time and pointed to one corner, saying that if truck traffic followed that route, the southern residential area would be forced into a bottleneck and the emergency system would not be sufficient. My father gave a faint dismissive laugh and told me not to guess about things beyond my ability. The next morning, the engineering team called. They had found exactly that flaw. I overheard it while passing by my father's office. He never mentioned me. But that evening at dinner, my grandmother looked at me with an expression both gentle and sharp like fire. And for the first time, I felt that someone truly saw me. After that, she began teaching me in a way no one ever had. She turned contracts into stories, negotiations into a game of strategy, and one rainy afternoon when I was frustrated with how slowly I read, she told me something I carried for years: "You are not slow. You read structure before others can even finish reading the words." I kept that sentence with me even when I did not have the courage to believe it, because at home everything stayed the same. Audrey remained the pride on display. She stood in the light while I stood at the edge. 3 months before I graduated high school, my grandmother called me to her house one afternoon without warning. Sunlight stretched across the wooden floor as she placed a heavy, cold metal box into my hands, locked with a worn brass latch. She looked at me for a long moment and told me to keep it safe, to hold on to it until the day my family showed me who they truly were. I laughed, thinking she was being too serious, because every family has someone who is loved more and someone who is overlooked. And I was too young to understand that some warnings are not born from pessimism. I brought the box home and pushed it deep into my closet behind winter coats. And when the door closed, I closed her words away in a corner of my memory as well, not knowing that one day, that very box would open a door my entire family had kept locked in front of me for as long as I could remember. Years later, I graduated from a public university in Washington, not a place my parents ever mentioned with pride. There was no grand ceremony, no important names showing up for me, but I finished, in my own way. That same month, I started working at Holloway Infrastructure Group as an administrative coordinator. The salary was enough to cover basic living. My job was to schedule meetings, prepare documents, coordinate rooms, and make sure everything was ready before the important people walked in. In that same month, Audrey joined the company as a strategic legal advisor. Her compensation package was talked about everywhere. People said her signing bonus was more than several years of my income. My desk was placed just outside the executive corridor, a unique position, close enough to hear, far enough that no one paid attention. Every day, I handled dozens of files, financial reports, investment proposals. High-value contracts passed through my hands before entering the meeting rooms. I sorted them, printed them, forwarded them. No one thought I understood what I was holding. No one lowered their voice in front of me. No one paused when discussing important decisions. They believed I was just someone on the outside. At first, I believed that too. But then, the pieces of information started to connect. An investor hesitated before signing. A project was accelerated unusually. A decision approved inside the meeting room was questioned the moment the door closed. I did not read fast, but when I turned everything into diagrams, it became clear. I started carrying a small notebook, not to write words, but to draw. Arrows connecting decisions, circles grouping interests, lines revealing hidden risks. Gradually, I did not just understand individual projects. I understood how the entire company operated, who truly made decisions, who only stood as a representative, the weaknesses beneath the perfect surface they tried to maintain. One project caught my attention more than all the others: the South Seattle Port redevelopment. On paper, it was a major opportunity, but when I mapped everything out, nothing aligned. Compensation did not match, legal timelines were shortened, environmental reports were adjusted in a favorable direction. If it continued, the project could become a serious issue. No one asked me, and I did not speak. I knew my place. One afternoon, Elisa Moreno stopped by my desk. She looked at my notebook for a moment and said my grandmother used to work this way. Then she walked away. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. At home, everything remained the same. Dinner revolved around Audrey. Her plans, her opportunities, her future were discussed as something inevitable. My father said she had leadership qualities. My mother said people trusted her immediately. I sat there listening, waiting for the conversation to end. 2 weeks later, I noticed Audrey's name appearing constantly in the executive schedule: strategic meetings, investment discussions, long-term planning. I knew because I was the one arranging them. One evening, while organizing archived documents, I found an old photograph of my grandmother. She stood in the middle of a construction site, sleeves rolled up, shoes covered in dust. Nothing like the formal portraits in the company lobby. On the back of the photo, there was a single line: built, not inherited. Elisa appeared behind me at that moment. She said my grandmother liked that photo, then added that my grandmother had spoken about me, that I saw what others overlooked. Then she left, as if everything that needed to be said had already been said. Spring arrived, and the company began preparing for a major event, a gala honoring Audrey. The guest list included influential figures, investors, and key partners. My mother personally oversaw every detail. It was not just a party, it was a statement about the future. 1 week before the event, I received an email. The subject was short: organizational restructuring. I opened it, read it once, then read it again. My position would be eliminated, effective July 1st, with a standard support package included. Through the wall behind my desk, I heard my father's voice. He said they could not keep me once Audrey stepped up. My mother said outsiders would ask questions. Then she said I was not suited for a leadership environment. I did not react. Not because I felt nothing, but because everything was already clear. Audrey's gala would take place the next evening, and I understood that I was not invited as part of the family. I was invited as someone about to disappear. Sometimes people do not need to remove you with a clear action. They only need to create a future where you do not exist, and wait for you to walk away on your own. If you have ever stood in front of a closed door without anyone explicitly telling you that you are not allowed inside, you will understand how the moment of realization can change everything. And if this story feels familiar, if you see a part of yourself in it, leave a comment, like, and subscribe, because the next part is only just beginning. The next evening, the hotel by Elliott Bay was lit like a stage, prepared for a story that had already been written. Lights reflected across the glass, music played in a steady rhythm, and expensive outfits moved between perfectly arranged tables. Everything in that room carried a clear message: success, power, and the future. I stood at the entrance for a few seconds before stepping inside. The dress I wore was the best I could afford on my salary, not striking, not attention-grabbing, fitting the role I had always known. No one noticed as I walked past them. Conversations continued. Handshakes were exchanged. Congratulations flowed easily. This was Audrey's world. My mother appeared beside me after a few minutes. She looked me up and down quickly, as if checking a minor detail before moving on to something more important. "You're here," she said. I nodded. She told me I would be seated at table 26, near the back, partially hidden by a large pillar. She spoke as if it was the most reasonable arrangement, then added that tonight was very important for Audrey, so I should not draw attention. I said I understood. She left immediately after. I found my table. From that position, the stage was still visible, but not clearly. The sound could still be heard, but from a distance. Everything felt placed just far enough that I was not completely removed from the scene, but never at its center. Guests continued to arrive, familiar names in the industry, influential people, those who had worked with my family for years. My father stood near the stage, shaking hands, speaking with confidence. My mother moved between tables, adjusting small details. No one looked for me. At 8:30, the lights dimmed. The music softened. My father stepped onto the stage and the room quickly fell silent. He raised his glass and began to speak. He talked about excellence, about effort, about building a sustainable future. He spoke about Audrey as the perfect example of all those things. When he mentioned her graduating with top honors, the room erupted in applause. When he said she had received an offer from one of the most prestigious law firms, people stood. Audrey stepped onto the stage, her dress standing out under the lights. She stood tall, confident, as if every gaze had always belonged to her. My father continued. He said Audrey was not only the pride of the family, but the future of Holloway Infrastructure Group. He said she would begin participating in high-level executive decisions, that one day she would lead everything the family had built. The room stood. Applause stretched on. Cameras flashed continuously. I clapped too, not because I believed the story, but because I was used to following the rhythm of the room. From table 26, I looked toward the stage and realized something simple. I had no place in the future they were describing. A woman sitting next to me turned and asked softly, "What will you do after tonight?" I did not answer immediately, not because I did not understand the question, but because I had already known the answer. The sound in the room gradually returned as the speech ended. People went back to their tables. Conversations resumed. Staff brought more drinks and food. I looked toward the entrance. A man stood there, not engaging in any conversation, wearing a simple gray suit. His eyes were not searching, they were fixed with intention. Then he looked at me. He began walking toward my table, each step steady, unhurried. As he got closer, the feeling became clear. He was not mistaken. When he stopped beside me, the surrounding noise seemed to fade. He said my name. I confirmed. He introduced himself as Caleb Foster, my grandmother's personal attorney. That immediately caught my attention. I said my grandmother had passed away years ago. He said he knew. Then he told me she had left something in his care, with very specific instructions, that he was only allowed to give it to me on the day my father publicly chose a successor. He reached into his jacket and took out a cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax. He handed it to me. He said this was something my father did not know existed. I took the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Around us, the party continued. Laughter, voices, the sound of glasses touching. On the stage, Audrey was taking photos with my parents, everything unfolding exactly as they had planned. Caleb added one more sentence before leaving. He said my grandmother believed I would understand when the time came. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, my name written in a familiar handwriting. In that moment, I realized something. Tonight was not over. It had only just begun. I left the table while everyone was still raising their glasses and celebrating. No one called my name. No one asked where I was going. That made leaving simple. The hallway behind the banquet room was lit with white light, completely different from the warm space inside. The music and voices were pushed back into a distant layer of sound behind the closed doors. Here, everything was clearer, quieter. I stopped near the service area and placed the envelope on the metal counter in front of me. My name appeared under the light, written in my grandmother's familiar handwriting, neat and decisive. I did not open it right away, not because I was afraid, but because I knew that once I did, nothing would go back to the way it was. The truth was, there was nothing left to go back to. I broke the seal. Inside were three things: a carefully folded letter, a notarized legal document, and a smaller envelope labeled "Read Later." I opened the letter first. Lena, if you are reading this, it means the day your father publicly chose a successor has arrived. I have thought about this moment for a long time. I hoped I could tell you in person, but some things can only be understood when you see them for yourself. You were never slow. You simply see the world differently, and people are often afraid of what they do not understand. I saw that very early. What comes with this letter is my final decision. I did not make it out of emotion. I made it because I understand what is happening and what will happen if nothing changes. Read carefully, then decide for yourself who you want to become. I folded the letter and set it aside. I picked up the legal document. The text was dense, precise, written in a way I had always avoided. I forced myself to read slowly, one line at a time. The meaning began to take shape. This was the final will of Ruth Holloway, executed and notarized in 2019, replacing all previous versions. I kept reading, then I stopped. Not because I did not understand, but because I understood too clearly. I read the line again. To my granddaughter, Lena Holloway, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Holloway Infrastructure Group, together with all voting rights associated therewith. 51%. Not a small portion. Not a support fund. Control. I lowered the document. Everything around me stayed the same: the white lights, the cold metal surface, the distant sound from the banquet room, but the order inside my mind had changed. I continued reading. The will explained the reason for this decision, not because Audrey lacked ability, but because I had been excluded, misjudged within a system I had never been allowed to enter. She knew everything, not guessed, not suspected, knew. At the end, a section was printed in bold. Control would only be activated if the beneficiary requested an emergency board meeting within 72 hours of receiving the document. 72 hours. I looked at my watch. 9:02 in the evening. The time had already started. I opened the smaller envelope. Inside was a single sheet. You will hesitate. That is why I set a deadline. No further explanation. I stood still for a few seconds. There was no third option. Either I did something or I did nothing. If I did nothing, everything would continue as planned. I would leave the company quietly. Audrey would step up. My father would retain control. Their story would become the only story. If I acted, everything would change. Not just within the family, but within the company, and in how people saw the name Holloway. I folded all the documents and placed them into my bag. I walked back toward the banquet room doors. The sound became clear again the moment I opened them. Music, laughter, conversation. Everything continued as if nothing had happened. Audrey stood at the center, speaking with a group of investors. My parents stood nearby, looking like people who had everything under control. No one knew what I was carrying. I did not return to table 26. I walked straight toward the exit. No one stopped me. Outside, the air was colder. Wind from the bay carried the scent of salt and metal. The city moved as it always did. I walked. Not fast, not slow, just in a different direction. When I got back to my apartment, everything was quiet. The living room light was still on. No one was awake. I placed the documents on the table, opened them again, read them one more time. 51%. The number did not change. I opened my laptop. A new email appeared. Position termination confirmed. Effective date. A brief thank you. Everything was clearer than ever. Tonight's gala was not just a celebration, it was a replacement. I closed the laptop and walked to the closet. I opened the door. The metal box was still there, exactly where I had left it years ago, covered with a thin layer of dust. I took it down, placed it on the table, and unlocked it. Inside were three things: another letter, an older legal document, and a small storage device. I opened the letter. Lena, if you are reading this, it means everything has unfolded as I expected. What you hold is not coincidence. It is preparation. This company was not built on reputation. It was built on difficult decisions not everyone is willing to make. The attached document is the original founding agreement. It ensures that control cannot be changed by the will of a single person. The storage device contains what you may need, not for revenge, but to make sure everything is placed where it belongs. I set the letter down and connected the device to my computer. Folders appeared: meeting minutes, internal emails, legal documents. One file stood out: board meeting recording, 2018. I opened it. My father's voice filled the room. He said my grandmother was no longer suitable for current business conditions. He proposed reducing her voting power. Other members objected. The vote did not pass. The file ended. I sat still. It was not a misunderstanding, not a difference of opinion. It was a plan. Everything my grandmother had done was not emotional. It was preparation. I looked at the time again, close to midnight. The clock kept moving. 72 hours. I took the business card Caleb had given me. The phone number was clear. I held my phone, paused for a second, then opened a message and typed a short line. I want to proceed. I looked at the screen, then pressed send. Nothing changed immediately. No loud sound, no visible sign, but I knew one thing. For the first time, I was not reacting to what my family had decided. I was making a decision of my own. And once that decision was made, there was no way back. The next morning, my phone vibrated before the sun had fully risen. Caleb Foster called at 7:12 in the morning. His voice was clear, direct. He said the documents had been prepared. The request for an emergency board meeting could be submitted that same day. To activate it, 3 board members needed to sign an agreement. One had already confirmed. The other 2 agreed that morning. I did not ask why they agreed so quickly. Caleb said my grandmother's reputation still carried weight in decisions like this. Some things did not require long explanations. An hour later, I walked into Holloway Infrastructure Group as I did every day. No one looked at me differently. No one knew what was unfolding behind that layer of normalcy. The main lobby was still polished. Employees moved as usual. Conversations continued as if nothing had changed. I passed the reception area, entered the elevator, and went up to my floor. My desk was still there. New emails waited. Meetings needed adjustment. Documents needed printing. I did everything as I always did. At 10:41, my phone vibrated again. A message from Caleb. The request has been submitted. The emergency board meeting has been activated. I read the line once. There was no announcement, no visible signal, but I knew something had begun. About an hour later, the atmosphere in the office shifted. Not obvious, but noticeable. Conversations became shorter. Doors closed faster. People exchanged looks instead of words. Information moved through the company in its own way, without needing to be announced. Elisa Moreno came to my desk. She looked at me longer than usual. She did not ask directly. She only said my grandmother used to look like this before important decisions. I did not respond. She gave a small nod and walked away. Early in the afternoon, my phone rang. Audrey. I answered. Her voice was no longer calm. She asked what I had done. I asked what she meant. She said my father had just received notice of an emergency board meeting. She said none of the usual members would initiate something like that, and she did not believe it was a coincidence. I said I was not involved in how board members chose meeting times. There was a pause. She said if I was trying to do something, I should stop before things went too far. I said I was just doing my job. The call ended. 20 minutes later, my father walked past my desk. He did not look at me. He did not stop. But the way he moved showed he knew. His office door closed harder than usual. His voice carried through the wall. He said the meeting was unnecessary. He said everything would be resolved quickly. He said my name. He said I was not involved, that I did not understand. I looked at the screen in front of me. Those words no longer had the same effect. The afternoon moved slower than usual. Near the end of the day, an official notice was sent to the relevant members. The emergency board meeting would take place on Saturday morning at 10, on the executive floor. 2 days. Time was no longer abstract. That evening, I returned to my apartment earlier than usual. I placed all the documents on the table: the will, the founding agreement, the recordings, the emails. I did not read them the usual way. I drew. Lines connecting decisions, arrows mapping relationships, intersections revealing risk. The South Seattle Port Project appeared at the center of the diagram. From it, multiple paths extended: legal, financial, community. Everything was connected. I looked at the whole picture. It was not just a family story. It was the direction of the entire company. I stopped. A question surfaced. What if they rejected me? What if they refused to accept the documents? What if everything ended in that room? I looked at the diagrams in front of me. I remembered what my grandmother had said. You do not need permission to understand. I organized the documents, placed them neatly together, and closed them. I did not try to erase the doubt. I simply refused to let it decide for me. Sometimes, the hardest moment is not facing other people. It is accepting that you have the right to step into a place where you have always been kept outside. If you have ever been in a position where silence felt heavier than speaking, you will understand that change does not begin with confidence. It begins with continuing forward, even when you are not ready. On Saturday morning, I would step onto the executive floor for the first time. Not to prepare the meeting room, but to take part in the meeting itself. On the weekend morning, the city was quieter than usual. I stood in front of Holloway Tower a few minutes before the scheduled time. The glass reflected a soft light. Everything outside looked the same, but I knew inside, a different order was about to be set. I walked through the main entrance, not using the employee entrance as I always had. The lobby was wide, nearly empty. A security guard asked for my name, checked the list, then directed me toward the executive elevator. The doors closed. The elevator moved to the top floor. I had been close to this level before, but I had never stepped into this area. This time, it did not stop at the familiar floors. The doors opened. The hallway ahead was wide and quiet. Light poured through the large glass panels. Everything was designed to create a sense of control and distance. I walked toward the boardroom. A security staff member stood at the door. He checked the list and said my name was not on it. Audrey's voice came from behind. She said I did not belong in this meeting, that it was a restricted session for those with direct responsibility. I said I was invited to present. She looked at me, not agreeing. My father appeared right after. He asked what I was doing there. Audrey said I had no right to attend. He said I should go home, that this meeting had nothing to do with me. The boardroom door opened. Thomas Whitmore stepped out. He looked at all three of us, then said I was invited in. He made it clear that it was his decision. No one said anything else. I walked in. The room was quiet, organized. A long table sat at the center. The board members were already present. Some looked at me, some avoided eye contact. Caleb Foster sat on the right side, giving a small nod. I was shown a seat at the end of the table. The meeting began. Thomas Whitmore briefly explained the reason for the session, an issue related to the company's ownership structure. Then he gave me the floor. I stood up. My father raised his hand. He said context needed to be clarified. He said I was only an administrative employee with no executive or legal experience. Audrey added that I struggled with complex documents. The words were spoken calmly, not directly aggressive, but enough to define me. I did not respond. I placed the documents on the table. I said I was not here to discuss my ability. I said I was here to present a document. I placed the will in front of them. The atmosphere in the room shifted. My father said it did not make sense. He said the inheritance had already been resolved. Caleb Foster stood up. He confirmed he was the certifying attorney. He said the document was valid. Thomas Whitmore took the will and checked the seal. Audrey said it was impossible for such a document to exist without anyone knowing. Caleb said that was entirely possible if it had been held under legal instruction. I began to read. To my granddaughter, Lena Holloway, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Holloway Infrastructure Group, together with all voting rights. The room fell silent. Some members looked at each other. Audrey said it could not be real. Caleb said under the law, the most recent will replaces all previous ones. Thomas Whitmore said if the document was valid, control of the company had already changed. My father said ownership meant nothing if the person inheriting it lacked the ability to operate the company. I said I was not proposing to run the company. That made people pay attention. Audrey asked what I wanted. I placed another file on the table. I played the recording from 2018. My father's voice filled the room. He proposed reducing my grandmother's voting power. The recording ended. No one spoke immediately. Thomas Whitmore looked at my father and asked if the content was accurate. My father said it was an internal discussion, taken out of context. I said the will had been created after that meeting. I said my grandmother had anticipated this. One board member said he remembered that meeting, that my grandmother had strongly opposed the idea. Audrey said even if the document was valid, ownership did not equal the ability to operate. I said I was not here to replace anyone immediately. I said I was here to clarify ownership. Thomas Whitmore said the board needed to verify the document. Caleb said copies had already been submitted for verification. The meeting paused. Members spoke quietly among themselves. Some made calls. Some reviewed documents. I sat still. My father stood on the other side of the table speaking with Audrey. They did not look at me. Everything had changed. Not because I spoke more, but because they could no longer pretend I did not exist. The meeting was not over yet, but the outcome had already begun to take shape. Nearly 40 minutes later, the board members returned to their seats. The calls had ended. Documents were placed back on the table. The atmosphere in the room was no longer the initial doubt, but something more measured, more cautious. Thomas Whitmore looked around the table and spoke. He said the verification had been completed with independent legal counsel. The will was recognized as valid under state law. There were no procedural violations. No one spoke immediately after. The conclusion was simple, but enough to shift every position in the room. Thomas continued. From this moment forward, Lena Holloway is the controlling shareholder of Holloway Infrastructure Group. There was no applause, no strong reaction, only silence. My father stood on the other side of the table. He did not deny it. He did not immediately argue. He only said the decision would be reviewed, that he had the right to request further examination. Caleb Foster responded at once. He said that was entirely possible, but the likelihood of changing the outcome was very low. Audrey looked at me. For the first time, her expression no longer carried its usual certainty. She said even if I held the shares, that did not mean I could run the company. The statement was familiar. For years, it had been how they ended every argument. Thomas Whitmore said under the company's charter, the controlling shareholder has the right to bring proposals before the board. He looked at me and said, I had the floor. Every eye in the room turned. This was the moment they were waiting for. I could demand immediate change. I could propose removing my father from his position. I could end everything with a single decision. For a few seconds, I imagined it. Then I remembered the letter my grandmother left behind. Not revenge, restoration. I stood up. I said I had a proposal. My father gave a faint smile. He said, of course. I said I was not proposing to replace leadership immediately. Some people in the room were surprised. Audrey looked at me as if she did not understand. I continued. I said I proposed that the board conduct a vote of confidence on the current CEO. Thomas Whitmore asked for clarification. I said the board would decide whether the current executive leadership still held their trust. If yes, everything would remain the same. If not, the transition process would be activated according to the company's rules. Audrey said it was unnecessary. I said it was a process the company had established from the beginning. One board member spoke in agreement. Another said the rules must be followed. Thomas Whitmore nodded. He said the proposal would proceed to a vote. My father looked at me. He said I was making a mistake. I did not respond. Thomas began the process. He asked those in favor of continuing confidence in Jonathan Holloway as CEO to raise their hands. A few hands went up. Those who had worked with him for years, those whose interests were tied directly to his position. Thomas counted. Then he asked those who did not support. The remaining hands rose, slower, but more. Thomas looked again to confirm. Then he announced the result. The majority had voted no confidence. Under the company's charter, the CEO would have 30 days to complete the transition out of the role. No one argued. No one objected. The outcome was clear. My father said nothing further. He looked at me, not the way he had for years, not a passing glance, Not a quiet judgment, but directly, as if trying to understand what had just happened. Audrey stood beside him. She did not speak. She did not react. The certainty she once carried was gone. There was no argument, no declaration. My father gathered the documents in front of him, turned, and walked toward the door. Audrey followed. The door closed behind them. The room fell quiet. Thomas Whitmore let out a breath. He said the board would continue discussing next steps. Interim leadership, my role in the new structure. I nodded. The conversation moved forward. Plans, processes, timelines. I listened, but not to every detail. Outside the glass, the city remained unchanged. Cars moved, people walked. There was no sign that a decision had just been made on this floor. After a while, the meeting ended. Members stood. Some approached me. Their congratulations were careful, measured. No one said too much. Everything stayed within limits. Caleb Foster stepped closer. He said my grandmother had prepared thoroughly. I said I understood that now. Elisa Moreno was there as well. She did not say much, only nodded. One by one, the others left. I remained for a moment, looking at the table where everything had just happened. There was no visible sign of a major shift. Nothing broken. Yet everything had changed. I was no longer standing outside the door. I was no longer waiting to be accepted. The decision had been made, not by emotion, but by the very structure they had built. I walked out of the room. The hallway was as quiet as when I entered. The elevator took me down. No one else was inside. In that space, I looked at my reflection in the glass. Nothing had changed on the outside, but my place in this story had completely changed. And for the first time, I did not need anyone to tell me I deserved to stand there. The elevator doors opened to the ground floor, and I stepped out like someone who had just finished something no one else in the building knew about. The lobby remained quiet in that familiar weekend way. No disruption, no sign that anything had shifted at the very top. Outside, the wind from the bay moved lightly through the air. The city continued in its usual rhythm, cars passing, people moving quickly, storefronts opening like any other day. Nothing in that scene reflected the fact that a structure of power had just been rearranged. Caleb Foster stood near the exit, waiting as if he already knew I would walk this way. He said everything had gone as expected, that the next steps would be completing legal procedures, issuing internal announcements, and preparing for the transition. I asked about the timeline. He said the official notice would go out within 24 hours, followed by meetings with investors and partners. I nodded. He added that my position would be clearly defined in the new structure, no longer a supporting role, but part of the decision-making process. I did not respond immediately, not because I did not understand, but because everything was happening faster than anything I had imagined. We discussed a few more details about what would come next, then Caleb left. I stood there for a moment before stepping out of the building. The streets of Seattle stretched ahead of me. Nothing looked different, yet I knew I was no longer standing in the same place. When I got back to my apartment, my phone began vibrating nonstop. The first email came from the company's internal system, an official announcement. Jonathan Holloway would step down as CEO within 30 days, according to company policy. Thomas Whitmore would take on the role of interim executive. Lena Holloway was appointed as strategic advisor to the board. I read the notice again. It was short, precise, without emotion, simply a confirmation of change. Then the messages started coming in. Colleagues, partners, people who had never reached out to me before. They wanted to meet, to talk, to establish connections. Names I had only seen in formal emails were now appearing in my call log. I did not respond to all of them. I selected a few. Most I left unanswered. The shift in how people saw me happened almost instantly, not because I had changed, but because my position had. Another message came through. Elisa Moreno. She wrote that my grandmother always said I could see what others overlooked, and that today I had proven it. I read it again, then saved it, not because it was long, but because it was enough. The afternoon passed more slowly. I was no longer working the way I used to. No meetings to prepare, no documents to print. I had time, and in that time, I began to look back at everything that had happened, not from the perspective of an employee, but from the position of someone who could influence what came next. I opened the diagrams I had drawn before. The South Harbor project still sat at the center, the connections unchanged, the risks still there. But this time, I was not just seeing the problems. I could act on them, not from outside a meeting room, but through decisions. That night, I received a call from my mother. Her voice was different, no longer carrying its usual control. She asked if we could meet. I agreed. We met at a cafe near downtown. She arrived first. When I sat down, she did not say much. There was a pause. Then she said she was sorry. No long explanation, no justification, just that one sentence. I did not respond right away, not because I had not heard her, but because I did not know what the answer should be. The conversation did not last long. Nothing dramatic changed, but for the first time, we spoke without roles, without the image of a perfect family to maintain, just two people. Then we left. No conclusion, no agreement, but something was different. The truth. When I returned home, the city was lit up, lights reflecting on the water like any other night. Everything outside remained the same, but inside, something had ended. Not in a single moment, but through a series of small decisions, one after another. And for the first time, I was not standing outside watching. I was part of those decisions. The next morning, the official announcement moved beyond internal channels. Financial news outlets published brief reports about the leadership change at Holloway Infrastructure Group. There were no personal details, only facts, timing, names, and new roles. I read a few of the articles, and the way they summarized everything made the entire process feel far simpler than it had actually been. A single line could replace years of silence. One decision could erase how a person had been defined for so long. My phone kept lighting up with notifications, meeting requests, invitations, and congratulations from people who had never known who I was before. I did not try to respond to all of them. I chose selectively, not because I wanted distance, but because I understood that not all attention carries the same value. The days that followed were filled with more meetings, but this time I was not preparing them. I was sitting in them, not to listen, but to participate. My new role became clearer. I worked directly with the board, focusing on long-term projects. Plans I once saw from a distance were now decisions I had to make. I did not try to change everything at once. I started with what I understood best, the South Harbor project. I requested a full review, environmental reports, compensation terms, legal risks. Some people objected, saying it would slow everything down. I said speed meant nothing if the foundation was flawed. The discussion went on, and in the end, the board agreed to pause part of the project for reassessment. It was not a loud decision, but it shifted direction, step by step. I did not try to become an executive overnight. I focused on understanding the system, not from the outside anymore, but from within. In the evenings, I often stayed late, not because of pressure, but because for the first time I did not have to guess what was happening. I could see the whole picture. A week later, Audrey texted me, asking if we could meet. We walked along the bay, just the two of us, no roles to maintain. She said that for years, she believed she was doing the right thing, that being perfect was the only way to secure her place in the family. She said she had not realized that it meant leaving me behind. I listened, without arguing, without agreeing right away. We did not resolve everything in one conversation, but we began, not as rivals, but as two people trying to understand what had happened. Time passed, summer arrived, and I moved into a new apartment near the water. Not bigger, just quieter. In the living room, I hung the old photograph of my grandmother that Elisa had shown me. She stood at a construction site, sleeves rolled up, not the image of an heir, but of a builder. I looked at that photo many times, not to remember, but to understand. What she left behind was not just shares or control, it was a way of seeing, a standard. One afternoon, as sunlight came through the window, I opened my old diagrams again. The arrows, the connections, the intersections were the same, but their meaning had changed. Before, they were how I understood the world. Now, they were how I changed it. I thought about everything that had happened, not the boardroom meeting, not the vote, but the moment I chose not to stay silent. For years, I had waited for a sign, for recognition, for someone to say I was enough. It never came. And eventually, I understood that a person's value is not defined by being seen, but by having the courage to face the truth. If there is one thing I take from all of this, it is this: being overlooked is not the end. It is only the beginning of a story you have not finished writing. And sometimes, when someone hears a story like this, they recognize a part of themselves in it. When that happens, the story does not end here. It continues in the decisions they choose to make next. Because the greatest legacy is not power. It is the moment you stop waiting for permission to believe in yourself. If you have stayed with this story until now, thank you. And if you see yourself somewhere in Lena's journey, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Do not forget to like and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Your support is what keeps these stories going.